Dr. Comfort, it's a pleasure meeting you. I mean, I'm going to have my second conversation with an African, and I feel so happy, seeing an African sitting beside me. I'm actually here for the African perspective of the Munich Security Conference, but you've been here. Do you think Africa presence is really here? Because I'm not seeing many Africans, by the way.
Well, unfortunately, the Africa Union summit is occurring at the same time, so the reasons maybe why you haven't seen more numbers here is partly because of that reason as well. But there are some here and who have been in various sessions, various panels, who are having their own bilaterals. But normally you would potentially have more leaders coming here. The president of Ghana was here for sure. And you had the South Africa Minister for Defense was here. So there, and you had the Kenya, both the UN ambassador and the cabinet secretary was here also from Kenya. So there is some presence here. It may not be a lot of them, but they're certainly here. But they've got their own continental summit going on right now.
Yeah. And you're born in England, London by Nigerian parent.
Exactly.
And are you monitoring the Nigerian elections?
Absolutely. We've put out our report looking at both the flashpoints around Nigeria, sort of looking at the potential risk for violence or not, looking at a very strong, robust National Elections Commission that is making sure that the voter process is credible, that there's trust in it. There's a lot of excitement because this is the first time in Nigeria's 25 years or so of democracy that we've got three strong candidates, and a very strong youth presence that is generating a lot of buzz, as you can imagine, when it comes down to elections in Nigeria.
If we were to vote today, who are you going to vote for?
You never reveal who you're going to vote for. Rule number one, you keep those things close to your... And you can imagine, if I was to say that, you can imagine what it would... Not that I myself can influence the outcome, but I will keep that. If I were able to vote today, I would certainly keep it close to my chest. I think what's significant about this vote is that we've got just a high number of people registered to vote, but significantly a number of young people. They see this as a crucial vote. A number of them feel energized after the unfortunate EndSARS protests. A number of them want to see real change, and they feel that this is, if there's a moment in which to vote, this is the one crucial vote, whether they feel that there's a lot at stake for them going forward.
You spend your whole entire career in conflict-affected countries.
That's right.
And I just want to know, the affected countries, are we looking at international, or is just based on the continent?
Actually, so it was, yes, a lot of it is predominantly within Africa, and a lot of my experience is that. But I also went to places outside of the continent when I first started research. So I was involved doing research in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then that took me to both Yerevan and Baku, Armenia and Azerbaijan. I also went to Nagorno-Karabakh itself. I went to Fiji and Solomon Islands just to see also, I was involved in a conflict assessment there. And then as a result of becoming president of Crisis Group, my sort of footprint has taken me to other regions and to see similar sort of situations, similar sort of different kind of conflicts, but nonetheless trying to understand conflicts in different regions as well.
I know currently, that there is a Russian-Ukraine war right now, and in Africa, most African leaders are saying the war that is happening in Ukraine, Russia, is actually having impact on Africa. Of which sometimes I personally don't understand why a war happening in another continent has to have impact on us on a different continent. I mean, when it comes to Europe and Europeans are saying that this war is affecting us, that's okay. But on another continent, I just want to get your opinion on that. What do you really think of that?
I think, so number one, I think we should discuss Ukraine and the tragedy, and the way in which the international principles around aggression was usurped by Russia's invasion. And that war didn't start last year. The very first incursion was in 2014 in Crimea. A war of this size, the magnitude of this side, has significant global ramifications. The consequence of this kind of aggression, you don't want that. You don't want to see that repeated elsewhere. So that's one ramification. You seeing this kind of principle being undermined. I think the other one, the sort of unintended consequences of the fallout of the conflict, is that it happened already in a context where the trend lines, multilateralism, peace and security, humanitarian distress, was already going in the wrong direction. And this was also coming in the context of the pandemic, and also climate change and climate adaptation and financing. You already had a very brittle economic downturn, and a number of countries on the continent who had a slightly more promising economic outlook in 2019 saw those trend lines reversing in terms of the economic gains and growth, and then saw it further depleted as a result, for example, of the sanctions. And I think there's been the secondary effects of sanctions. And so a number of countries on the continent, for example, experienced energy price hikes, this whole commodity shocks. A number of countries that already had food insecurity problems then saw a tsunami of problems as a result of the fallout of the war as well.
I think this comes to my next question. Africa has the world 60% arable land. You don't think we should start feeding ourselves so that such conflict don't happen, don't have much more effect on the motherland? Because let me ask you this. Within Africa itself, I know and believe that there is war going on in Ethiopia, which even we're not hearing much about until I found myself in Ethiopia and I found that, there's war going on in Ethiopia. As Africans, the African Union, when something is happening within the continent, you don't think we should focus on Africa first before jumping out of Africa? Because I think that makes more sense, because I feel like we need each other. I think I've been in this conference and I see how European leaders are just making sure Ukraine get better, or things happening in Ukraine get better. And that is a spirit that I think we need to learn from the Europeans, that if a war is happening in Africa, we need to come together as continent and then fight this wars, but it's not happening. So I just want to get your opinion on what is happening on the motherland, but we decide to forget about it and then jump on international market just to see, okay, there's war happening in Ukraine and we all have to, put a bit of solidarity behind them. What is your take on that?
So the number of questions in there that you asked. One of the things that has been exposed by the war in Ukraine is the dependency that a number of countries had, for example, on Russian oil, and that's also sparked off an sort of energy diversification of where we get our energy, where we get our oil and gas from as well. So that's been an interesting conversation. And countries like Nigeria would have seen the unfortunate choice of words, but benefit. They've seen the benefit also of this crisis, because from an energy boom perspective, and also Algeria as well. So there is that issue in terms of how we need to sort of rethink putting our eggs in one basket, but diversifying the choices of where we get our resources from. You're quite right also about the fact that we need to think about our own manufacturing-based productivity and taking the agriculture seriously. On this point that you raised about Africa and African leaders, I want to separate leaders from citizens. African leaders and the African Union taking crises on the continent seriously. I mean, to be fair, the African Union, since it was rebranded, recreated in 2002, 2003, had a very robust, very forward-leaning constitutive act that really was more interventionist than the previous Organization for Africa Unity. And in the early years of the African Union, we saw a more sort of forward-leaning, a willingness by a core group of leaders to want to engage and intervene in certain crises as well. And you saw in the region that you and I both come from, ECOWAS, the regional body, is often seen as the poster child for conflict resolution, going into Liberia, going into Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast. We can scrutinize that, but nonetheless, there is a history of Africa leaders getting engaged in their conflicts as well. So I just want to put that on the table. Now, you're asking why there isn't a sense of urgency that you may have witnessed on the European side vis-a-vis Ukraine, why we haven't seen that. That's a very fair question to ask. The AU wants to be regarded as the primary political body for peace and security on the continent, and that requires responsibility as well, and that requires leaders to have a very honest conversation about how you begin to, well, first the roots of the crisis, but then how you begin to respond to those crises as well. And there's been a reform agenda within the African Union. There was an effort to rethink how it does this better. There was an effort to make the continent more self-sufficient. To lead first. And I think there's been a degree of disappointment in how that continent has handled certain crises. But I'm talking to you at the time when the same African Union also led the Pretoria Agreement process that led to the first phase of the Ethiopian and bringing the war to an end in Ethiopia, and then that was taken to Nairobi to have another peace process as well. So the picture, is mixed, and nonetheless, I take your criticism well as well.
Are you really proud of the African Union?
I'm proud of the idea of what it aspires to be. And also, when you look across the world now, when there's a lot of criticism and skepticism about multilateralism, the one multilateral body that all international partners want to engage with has been the African Union. And that says a lot about where the African Union is, or where international actors want the African Union to be in. I believe in the idea of multilateralism. I believe in the idea of the regional actors. I believe that to solve a crisis, to find a solution for a crisis, you have to also work within regional bodies. And so I believe in the idea of a regional architecture. And the AU, when you look across all the regions of the world, by the way, the AU is the poster child. I said that ECOWAS was, but internationally it is quite a significant role that it's playing, taking a frontline role. A number of African troops have died in a number of conflicts on the continent that are judged to be international peace and security, a threat to international peace and security. When you judge a crisis to be a threat to international peace and security, it then has to be handled by the United Nations Security Council. And oftentimes the African Union, within the principle of subsidiarity and the region first, is asked to try first to resolve it. And the soldiers, the armies of a number of countries have paid a heavy price in the name of peacekeeping as well.
And when it comes to peacekeeping, especially in West Africa, recently we've seen quite a number of coup d'etats. I mean, leaders just rising up and then taking power and all of that in West Africa. I think it's becoming rampant in the region right now. I think if you should say something about what is happening, because we don't want it to, cut across the entire region. It's happened. I think we've had over 3 or 4.
Actually also into Sudan as well, in the midst of a transition. There was an interesting session here at the Munich Security Conference where President of Ghana also was attending that. And the question there was whether we have an epidemic of coups. And it's very unfortunate that the region where significant international investment had taken place about 15 or 20 years, with 3 peacekeeping missions, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Ivory Coast, and then the decision to create a United Nations office in Senegal. And also the investment that a number of countries themselves had made. Nigeria, Ghana, being a leading peacemaker country. It's unfortunate to see this reversal. 2 coups in 9 months in Burkina and Mali, and then Guinea-Conakry at the same time, and then in Chad, and then in Sudan. And so it is a very worrying time, particularly in a region where we saw democratization going in the right direction as well. So this is a testing time. I think we need to ask a number of questions, not just of leaders, but also of the body that they invested heavily in, ECOWAS, to focus on crisis prevention and taking prevention seriously, and that leaders don't treat bodies like ECOWAS as a club for leaders, but that when they see leaders misbehaving, that they insert themselves straight away to deal with unconstitutional change of power. It's not just the militaries who are usurping governance. It's also leaders who seek to change the constitution to stay in power. It was an interesting term that I discovered in Peru, for example, where there was a self-coup that was taking place there. But what I understand from that within the West Africa context is leaders trying to write themselves into longer stay in power as well. And I think that is a real wake-up call right across the continent, and how to reverse that as well.
I think when it comes to the ECOWAS region, sometimes as a young Ghanaian who travels within Africa, I think I've been to 27 African countries, just exploring, promoting in a positive light, and seeing that it's so difficult as a young African from Ghana to travel from Ghana to the nearby country, Togo. But yet we have a body called ECOWAS, we have a body called African Union, and I still don't get it, because when I came to Europe, I mean, I've never been coming here. It's just my first time being here. And I had only one visa. I was able to travel to Amsterdam. I found myself in Austria with one visa. And here I am in Germany. You don't think something needs to be done? Enough of the theoretical, politics, and we start becoming like more pragmatic, or maybe, practical, because it's logic, a normal logic for a young African to travel from one country to another, but it's not happening.
So I'm not a politician.
I know,
I'm not a leader,
but
my mandate is conflict prevention. But on this particular, as a citizen as well, yes, of course, the ECOWAS passport is supposed to allow us to travel freely through our continent, and we've also seen that tensions between neighboring countries also undermines our ability to move freely. Nonetheless, the refugee flow also, as a result of conflict, has taken a toll. As part of the reform agenda that I was mentioning, that the African Union undertook, started in 2016 and then continued under President Kagame from Rwanda, was the idea of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And for that trade agreement to work effectively, it would assume that the peoples of the continent can move across regions freely, and that I should not necessarily need a visa to go to any particular country. So it's a question, when you get a leader on your YouTube, you should ask them that question, because I, as a citizen, would like to move freely across the continent.
Dr. Comfort, thank you so much for talking to me, and I hope you had a comfortable time.
There are many jokes about my name, but that one is a tried and tested one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.